I was 11 years old when my grandmother placed my hands on the ivory keys of that Bosendorfer and said, "This piano has more memory than any human being alive." I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. My name is Delilah Voss. I'm 34 years old. I live in a penthouse in the West Loop of Chicago, and I run a wealth management firm that handles nine-figure portfolios for some of the most powerful families in this country. I wear Louboutins to board meetings. I take red-eyes to Manhattan like other people take the bus. I've sat across negotiating tables from men twice my age and watched them blink first every single time. None of that happened because I was lucky. All of that happened because of one Sunday afternoon in October when my parents sold my daughter's piano, my grandmother's piano, for $87,000 and spent every last cent building a swimming pool for my sister's kids in Scottsdale. Let me take you back to where this really starts. My grandmother, Rosalind Voss, was not a soft woman. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to the grocery store and kept her spine straight even when the world was trying to break her in half. She grew up poor in rural Georgia, married a man who became a real estate developer in the late 60s, and by the time I was born, she had more money than most of our extended family knew how to process. She had taste, she had discipline. She had a 1927 Bosendorfer Imperial Concert Grand Piano that she'd bought at auction in Vienna in 1989 for what was then considered an obscene amount of money, and which, by the time my daughter Nora inherited it, had become worth considerably more. Grandma Rosalind gave that piano to Nora on her 7th birthday, not as a prop, not as decoration. She gave it because Nora had the gift, the same way Rosalind herself had it at that age. She flew in from her home in Savannah, Georgia, wearing a cream linen suit, and she sat next to my daughter on the bench and played the first bars of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and Nora, this 7-year-old child, put her tiny hands on the keys and played it back. Not perfectly, but she played it back. Rosalind looked at me across the room with eyes that were wet and said, "This piano belongs to her now. Put that in writing." I did. I had my attorney, Priya Sethi, draft a formal gift agreement. The piano belonged to Nora Eleanor Voss, minor, held in protective trust until she reached 18. It was documented, notarized, filed. My parents knew this. That is the part I cannot get past, even now. They knew. My parents, Gerald and Pamela Voss, live in a 7,000-square-foot home in Paradise Valley, Arizona. My father made his money in commercial real estate, same as his father before him, though Gerald had a talent for spending it faster than he made it that my grandfather never did. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had quietly started subsidizing their lifestyle. I paid for the home renovations in 2019. I paid off a home equity line they'd taken out in 2021 without telling anyone. I sent a check every Christmas that I told myself was a gift, and that was, in reality, a lifeline. I did all of this because I loved them, because I believed family meant something, because I told myself that people who love each other take care of each other, and I was in a position to take care. What I didn't understand, what took me until that October to finally accept, was that in my family, generosity was not interpreted as love. It was interpreted as weakness. It was a signal that I could be taken from. My sister, Trisha, is 4 years younger than me. She married a man named Boyd Halcourt who sells pharmaceutical devices and has the kind of permanent sunburn that comes from too many golf weekends and too little self-reflection. They have 3 kids. They live in a big house in Scottsdale. They have always, in the language of our family, been the ones who needed a little extra help. I was the one who had figured it out, which meant I was the one who could afford to give. I cannot tell you exactly when my parents decided that my financial success gave them the right to take from my daughter. I can only tell you what they did. In September of that year, I was in New York for 3 weeks, closing a deal that required every ounce of attention I had. Nora was 11, staying with my parents in Paradise Valley because my nanny had a family emergency and my backup childcare had fallen through, and my parents had offered, enthusiastically, warmly, with what I believed was genuine love, to have her. Nora told me later that Grandpa Gerald had a man come to look at the piano in the second week of her stay. She said the man walked around it slowly, lifted the lid, pressed a few keys. She said Gerald told her the man was just a tuner. She said something felt wrong, but she didn't know how to say it because she was 11 years old and he was her grandfather, and she had been taught to trust him. The piano was gone by the time I landed back in Chicago 3 weeks later and drove down to collect her. My mother told me over the phone, the night before I arrived, as if it were a footnote, as if she were mentioning they'd rearranged the living room furniture. "We sold Nora's piano, honey. We needed the money. It went to a good home." I remember standing in my kitchen in the West Loop, in my coat, my luggage still by the door, and feeling something shift in my chest that was not grief and was not anger. It was something colder than both of those things. It was clarity. "How much?" I said. $87,000. It was a fair price, Delilah, the market. That piano belonged to Nora. It was in a legal trust. "You're being dramatic. It's a piano. We'll get her another one." "Where is the money, Mom?" Silence. Then, "We've already put it toward Trisha's pool project. The kids have needed somewhere to—" I hung up. I sat down in my kitchen floor in my coat with my luggage still by the door, and I stayed there for 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I thought. That's what I do when the world breaks something in me. I go very, very still, and I think. I drove to Paradise Valley the next morning. I walked in. My mother was in the kitchen making coffee like it was any other Sunday. My father was on the back patio reading the paper. Nora was in the guest room, and when I went in to hold her, she cried in a way that made me feel physically ill. Not the loud crying of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet, confused crying of someone who has been hurt by a person they trusted and doesn't yet have the language to explain why that's different from regular hurt. "It's okay, baby," I told her. "It's going to be okay." I meant it, but not in the way she understood me to mean it. I called Priya from the driveway. "I need to know exactly how to proceed," I said. She walked me through every option: civil suit for conversion of protected property, breach of fiduciary responsibility, recovery of the asset or its cash value with interest and legal fees. She told me we had an excellent case. She told me we could move fast. "Do it," I said, "but quietly. I don't want them to know it's coming until it's here." That was the last time I moved quickly on any part of this. What I did next was something that took me months to construct and years to fully appreciate. I did not blow up my family in a dramatic confrontation. I did not post anything on the internet. I did not tell a single mutual friend or relative what had happened. I went home to Chicago. I resumed my life. I sent my normal Christmas check. I attended Thanksgiving in Paradise Valley with a smile on my face and wine in my hand, and absolutely nothing visible behind my eyes. Because here is what I knew about people like my parents, people like Boyd and Trisha. They were only dangerous when they were prepared, when they saw you coming. I spent those months building something they couldn't see. The first thing I did was buy back the piano. It had been sold to a private collector in Dallas, a man named Fletcher Gould, who had purchased it for his wife's music room. I reached out through an intermediary. I told him I represented a buyer willing to pay a significant premium for the instrument due to its family provenance. Fletcher Gould was not a sentimental man, but he was a practical one, and when I offered him $112,000 for a piano he'd paid $87,000 for, he took it. The Bosendorfer came back. I had it stored in a climate-controlled facility in Chicago while I figured out what came next. The second thing I did was hire a private investigator named Garrett Finch. I didn't hire Garrett to dig up dirt exactly. I hired him because I had spent enough years in wealth management to know that when someone makes a decision as reckless and legally exposed as selling a minor's protected asset, it is usually not the only reckless and legally exposed decision they've made. I asked Garrett to look at my parents' finances, their LLC structures, their real estate holdings, the paper trail around Boyd Halcourt's business interests, which had always struck me as slightly fuzzy around the edges. Garrett came back to me 8 weeks later with a file that was considerably thicker than I'd expected. Gerald Voss had been quietly liquidating jointly held assets that were also partially my grandmother Rosalind's from the estate of my grandfather, for 3 years. He had moved the proceeds through 2 shell LLCs in Delaware and 1 in Wyoming. Some of the money had gone to support his own lifestyle. Some of it had gone to Trisha and Boyd. Approximately $240,000 of it had gone to a woman named Stacia Brennan, who was 29 years old, lived in a condo in Tempe, and had been my father's girlfriend since 2020. My mother did not know about Stacia Brennan. Or so I believed, until Garrett sent me a second file 3 weeks later, and I discovered that Pamela Voss had her own accountant, her own offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and had been skimming from a joint investment account she managed with my father for the better part of a decade. She was not a victim of my father's betrayal. They were, in their own strange way, running parallel betrayals of everyone around them, including each other. I sat with this information for a long time. I thought about what to do with it. I thought about the version of me that wanted to detonate it immediately, send everything to every person in our family, burn it all down in an afternoon. I thought about whether that version of me would actually feel better afterward, or whether she'd just feel empty in a different way. I decided against detonation. I decided on architecture. My grandmother Rosalind did not know any of this yet. She was 81 years old, sharp as a blade, living in her house in Savannah with her garden and her books and the photograph of her late husband on the mantel. I called her every Sunday. We talked about Nora's progress at school, about what I was reading, about the jasmine in her garden. I did not tell her about the piano for 3 months. When I finally did tell her, I drove to Savannah. I sat across from her at her kitchen table, and I laid it out plainly: the sale, the trust violation, the money, the pool. Rosalind didn't say anything for a long moment. She folded her hands on the table. She looked out the window at the garden. Then she said, "I've been waiting for something like this." I asked her what she meant. She told me that she had been watching my father's behavior for years, that she had noticed discrepancies in the estate accounting, that she had her own attorney, not the family attorney, her own private attorney who had been quietly documenting irregularities for the last 18 months. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder that was nearly as thick as Garrett's. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions about how his estate was to be managed," she said. "Gerald has not been following those instructions. I've been patient because I didn't want to disrupt the family. But patience," she said, and she looked at me with those dark eyes, "patience has a ceiling." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Grandma, I think it's time to build something." She squeezed my hand and said, "I've already started." I want to tell you about the dinner party because it was the moment when everything I had built became visible. It was a Saturday evening in March, 14 months after the piano was sold. I hosted a dinner at my penthouse in the West Loop. I told my parents it was a family celebration. Nora had placed first in a regional youth piano competition, and I wanted everyone together. I told them Rosalind would be there. I invited Trisha and Boyd. I invited my uncle Raymond, Rosalind's son, who was also a trustee on my grandfather's estate. I invited Priya, my attorney, whom my parents had met enough times to find unremarkable. I invited Garrett Finch, who I introduced simply as a colleague. Everyone arrived at 7. The apartment looked beautiful. Norma played for 20 minutes before dinner, a Ravel piece she'd been working on for months. And I watched my parents applaud and smile, and I felt something in my stomach that I can only describe as the particular cold of absolute certainty. Dinner was warm. Conversation flowed. Boyd made a joke about the stock market. My mother complimented the centerpiece. My father had a second glass of Bordeaux and loosened up enough to put his arm around my mother's shoulder. Trisha talked about the pool, how much the kids were loving it, how it had transformed their summers. I let her finish. I smiled. I refilled her glass. After dessert, when the table was full of empty plates and the comfortable lethargy of a good meal, I stood up. "I want to say something," I said. Everyone looked at me. My mother smiled the way she does when she expects a toast. I said, 14 months ago, you sold my daughter's piano, a piano that belonged to her legally, documented and notarized, held in trust. You sold it without my knowledge, without her consent, and without legal authority, and you used the money to build a swimming pool. I have spent the last 14 months deciding what to do about that. Tonight, I want to share where I landed. The table went very quiet. My father opened his mouth. My mother started. "Hold on," I said, and something in my voice stopped them both cold. I looked at Rosalind, who was sitting at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her posture perfect, and she gave me one small nod. I said, "Grandma, do you want to start or should I?" Rosalind set down her water glass. She looked at my father, her son, for a long moment. She said, "The piano was insured under my name, Gerald. Did you know that when you sold it?" My father's face did something complicated. "Because," Rosalind continued, "when an insured asset is sold without the policyholder's consent and the proceeds are dispersed, that creates a rather interesting legal situation. Priya, would you like to explain?" Priya, who had been sitting quietly with a glass of wine and an expression of complete professional neutrality, opened the slim folder she'd brought and began to speak in the measured, unflappable tone she uses when she is absolutely certain she will win. She explained the civil recovery action already filed in Cook County. She explained the parallel filing in Maricopa County related to the estate irregularities. She explained the documentation Rosalind's attorneys had compiled regarding the mismanagement of my grandfather's estate, the LLCs, the transfers, the distributions to Trisha and Boyd that had been made from funds that were not Gerald's to distribute. Boyd's sunburn went 2 shades darker. Trisha grabbed his arm. "You can't," my father said. "Already done," I said quietly. Then Raymond, who had not said a single word all evening, who had eaten his dinner and watched and waited, opened his own folder and placed a document in front of my father, a formal trustee notice, a demand for accounting. My grandfather's estate was subject to a full audit, and Gerald Voss's access to any remaining assets was suspended pending the outcome. "Raymond," my father said, and I have never heard that particular register of fear in a man's voice before or since. "You've had a long run, Gerald. It's over." My mother turned to me. Her face was a complicated map of anger and something that might have been the beginning of shame. "You did this. You brought all of this into our family." "No," I said, "you did. 14 months ago, over $87,000. For a pool." The table was very still. Then Nora, my daughter, 11 years old, who had been sitting at the end of the table in a navy dress, who had played Ravel for these people an hour ago with her whole heart, said to her grandmother Rosalind across the room, "Grandma, is the piano okay?" Rosalind's expression broke open into something I had never seen on her face before, pure, unguarded love. She said, "Baby, the piano is better than okay." I reached into my bag and put an envelope on the table in front of Nora. She opened it. Inside was a photograph of the Bosendorfer in its storage facility, draped in protective cloth, waiting. Nora put her hand over her mouth. My mother looked at the photograph. I watched her understand that I had brought it back. I watched her understand what that meant, that I had spent over $100,000 of my own money to fix what they had broken, not because I couldn't afford it, not because it was easy, but because my daughter was worth it, and they had made a very serious miscalculation about who I was. What followed was not clean or fast, because nothing in law ever is. The civil case in Cook County settled 11 months later. My parents paid back the $87,000 plus interest and legal fees, totaling just over $114,000, which went directly into Nora's trust. The estate audit recovered approximately $380,000 in misappropriated funds, which were redistributed according to my grandfather's original instructions, a significant portion of which, as it turned out, was meant to come to me and Rosalind, not to Gerald at all. Boyd Hall Court's financial entanglements with some of those distributions meant he spent an uncomfortable several months with his own attorney managing his exposure, though he ultimately escaped anything criminal by the skin of his considerable luck. My father's affair with Stacia Brennan became known to my mother not through me. I made a deliberate choice to leave that particular hand unplayed, to let it surface on its own timeline. It surfaced 8 months after the dinner party, when my mother found a credit card statement she wasn't meant to see. She called me. She cried. I listened. I said all the things a daughter says. I did not say I knew. I did not say there is also a Cayman account you should ask about. I said, Mom, you deserve to know the truth about your own life, and you deserve to decide what to do with it. She filed for divorce in October of that year. In the settlement, she received the Paradise Valley house and a substantial share of assets. Some of those assets, as it happened, were ones that should have come to the estate, but by that point the audit was complete and Rosalind's attorneys had already recovered what belonged to the family. Pamela Voss walking away with a comfortable life was not injustice. It was just the particular exhaustion of watching people land on their feet when they probably shouldn't. I have not forgiven my mother. I have also not cut her off. We exist in a careful, honest distance that is probably the most truthful version of our relationship that has ever existed. She knows I know. I know she knows I know. We talk on the phone on Sundays. We are careful with each other. That is what we have. My father and I do not speak. Trisha reached out once, about 6 months after the dinner party. She sent me a long email that began with the word Delilah and contained many sentences that started with, "You have to understand," and "We were in a really difficult place financially," and ended with something that might have been an apology if you tilted your head and squinted at it sideways. I read it twice. I wrote back 2 sentences. "I understand that you were in a difficult place. I hope you find a better way through the next one." I have not heard from her since. The Bosendorfer came home in April. I had it delivered to our apartment on a Tuesday morning when Nora was at school. The movers brought it in through the freight elevator. It barely fit, and there was a tense 20 minutes where I genuinely thought we might have to remove a door frame. But it came through. It sat in the corner of the living room by the window that looks out over the West Loop, and the light hit it the way light hits something that has always been meant to be exactly where it is. I picked Nora up from school myself that afternoon, which I don't always get to do. She talked the whole ride home about a history project and a disagreement with her best friend, and whether I thought she should audition for the spring showcase. I nodded and asked questions and kept my eyes on the road and felt something warm and steady in my chest that I think might be the closest I come to peace. When we got upstairs and she opened the front door, she stopped walking. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She didn't say anything. Then she crossed the room slowly, the way you approach something you're afraid might disappear if you move too fast, and she put both hands on the lid of the piano. She stood there with her palms flat against the wood, like she was checking for a heartbeat. "Mom," she said. "I know, baby." She turned around and looked at me, and her face was doing approximately 17 things at once, and then she sat down on the bench, lifted the lid, and placed her hands on the keys. The first notes of the Chopin Nocturne, the same one Rosalind had played for her 4 years ago on her 7th birthday, filled the apartment. I leaned in the doorway and watched my daughter play, and I let myself feel the full weight of everything that had happened: the betrayal, the months of cold, careful work, the dining table in March, the lawyers, the audit, the long, slow unraveling of people I had loved and trusted, and I let myself feel, underneath all of that, the particular satisfaction of a woman who built something when the world tried to take something from her. I thought about what Rosalind had said to me that Sunday morning in Savannah with the folder on the table between us. Patience has a ceiling. What she hadn't said, what I understood now, was that the ceiling isn't a limit, it's a launching point. I called Rosalind that evening when Nora was in bed. "It's home," I told her. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear the sounds of her garden through the phone, the particular Savannah evening, cicadas, a far-off car. "I knew it would be," she said. "You always know." "No," she said. "I always prepare. That's different." I leaned back against my kitchen counter and looked out at the Chicago skyline through the window. All those lights, all those lives happening simultaneously in all those buildings, all those families with their private geographies of love and betrayal and the long arithmetic of who is owed what. "Grandma," I said, "what did you mean when I was little, when you said the piano has more memory than any human being alive?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A piano holds everything that has ever been played on it, every hand, every piece of music, every person who ever sat down in front of it. You can't hear it, but it's there, in the wood, in the strings. The instrument remembers even when the people don't." I thought about the Bosendorfer in the next room, everything it had held, my grandmother's hands in Vienna, the living room in Savannah, Nora at 7, playing back those notes like she'd always known them, the cold storage facility in Chicago, Fletcher Gould's music room in Dallas, the freight elevator, the afternoon light. "I think I understand that now," I said. "You always did," Rosalind said. "You just needed to live enough of it." Nora is 13 now. She placed second at a national youth competition in Boston last fall, first in her age division. She is learning Liszt. She practices for 2 hours every evening, and sometimes I come home late from the office and the apartment is full of music before I even open the door, and I stand in the hallway for a moment before I go in, just to hear it, just to let it land. My firm had its best year on record. I brought in 4 new clients from referrals alone, opened a satellite office in New York, and hired 2 portfolio managers who are frankly better at certain things than I am, which is exactly the kind of thing I used to be afraid to admit and now consider a professional advantage. I am not in a relationship, though I have been on several very good dinners in the last year with a structural engineer named Corinne who makes me laugh in a way that's good for me. We'll see. I am, by almost any measure, okay. More than okay. I want to say something about revenge before I close this out, because I think the word gets used wrong. People use it to mean destruction, blowing something up, burning it down, making sure someone suffers in a way that's visible and dramatic and satisfying in the moment. I understand the appeal of that version. I felt the appeal of it myself, standing in my kitchen with my coat and my luggage by the door, listening to my mother tell me the money was already gone. But destruction is loud and fast, and it ends. What I did was different. What I built took patience and precision, and the kind of cold clarity that only comes from deciding very deliberately that you will not be controlled by the urgency of your own anger. What I built was lasting, legal, documented. It changed the actual material reality of my family's finances and power structures in ways that cannot be undone. It gave Nora back what was hers. It gave Rosalind the accounting she had been owed for years. It gave my mother, in a strange way, a kind of accidental freedom she might never have reached on her own. And it gave me something I didn't expect: the knowledge that I am the kind of person who can hold something for 14 months without letting it corrode her, who can sit at a dinner table and eat lamb and drink Bordeaux and smile and make conversation while carrying the full weight of what she knows and what she's built, and wait. My grandmother was right about the piano. It remembers. So do I.